Coming off one of the most disastrous weeks of the season, plus mounting injuries all across the league, fantasy owners are scrambling for some much needed help. Add in the fact that Derrick Henry and James Cook are both on buys this week as well, you might be dipping into the reserves to try and find some running backs that you can trust in week 7. So let's go ahead and start with our BRUNT Workhorse report to take a look at which running backs are seeing the most volume in the league right now. And at the very top, it's obviously still Christian McCaffrey. This dude has 46 receptions, which isn't even closed in on by anybody else in the league at the running back position. And of course, over 100 rushing attempts right now. So far across the league, there are only 3 running backs that have seen 100 rushing attempts through the first 6 weeks of the season. Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, and Ashton Genty. And it might be shocking to see guys like Alvin Kamara and Tony Pollard at 11 and 12, outperforming guys like James Cook. He's still the number 6 running back in football right now. J.K. Dobbins has been getting a ton of volume, but he's even outperformed by some of these guys whose fantasy numbers aren't nearly as good as what we would like. And then how about at the bottom of the list? Guys who have missed time for the last couple of weeks, Bucky Irving and Omarion Hampton. They're still inside the top 24 right now, even with those injuries. Rico Dowdle has worked his way inside the top 19 after a couple of huge back-to-back weeks. And even Kenneth Walker, who is causing a lot of concern for a lot of people right now, still inside the top 24 and more touches than even Bijan Robinson. And just like the sponsor of this segment, BRUNT, these running backs are offering high performance upside regardless of the work they are getting. BRUNT high performance workwear can offer you all day comfort, heavy duty durability, and it's made for any trade that you may be in. And if you head on over to brunt.com or use the link in the description down below of this video, you can get $10 off of your order right now by using code HEADLINERS when you check out. Let's go ahead and kick off our matchup analysis with Thursday Night Football, Pittsburgh at Cincinnati. And fantasy owners of Jaylen Warren 3 weeks ago were completely caught off guard when he was a surprise inactive on Sunday morning. A lot of people couldn't even get him out of their lineup. They ended up going to the bye, and last week he returned from that injury. Now that performance last week wasn't the greatest, 52 yards on 11 carries. However, it was against a very good Cleveland defense that has shut down much better running backs this season. Now, he had 13 total touches because he had a couple of receptions as well. And Kenneth Gainwell got a little bit more work in the passing game. Maybe that was by design. But this week, going up against Cincinnati, currently allowing the most fantasy points per game, the 4th most receiving yards to running backs, and the 2nd most rushing yards to running backs, Jaylen Warren has an opportunity to go back inside the top 24 this week. Chase Brown is quickly trending down. And even if he pops off and has an excellent game on Thursday Night Football, what statistics do you currently see that would convince you to play him over some of the other options that you may have? The one thing that we needed to hope for with Chase Brown when Joe Flacco came into town is that he would continue to get targets in the passing game, because realistically, that was the only way that he was even coming close to fantasy relevancy right now. And he only got 2 targets last week. On top of that, he now has back-to-back weeks with less than 10 rushing attempts. So as of right now, there is nothing that's pointing towards Chase Brown being a solid fantasy option this week. Raise your hand if you're tired of these London games and you're excited that this is the last one for the season. London, I hope you enjoy these games. Anybody internationally, I hope you enjoy these games. It's cool that you get an opportunity to watch a product in person that isn't readily available normally. However, these games tend to be terrible, and last week was a prime example of it. This week, we get a better team in the LA Rams, and maybe in Jacksonville as well. But for Kyren Williams, I'm absolutely going to roll with him. He's been a top 10 running back 3 of the last 4 games. And he also continues to get some work in the passing game as well. And you got to wonder if he's got a solid floor in the passing game this week, because Puka Nacua may not be able to go. On the other side though, Travis Etienne, he continues to trend down as well. His last couple of games have not been very solid. The last 2 games, he has 24 rushing attempts for only 76 yards. He only has long runs of 8 and 7 yards in both of those games. He's not even breaking making big plays anymore at this point. He has 14.8 fantasy points total over the last couple of weeks. It's just been a really, really tough couple of weeks for those of you that have been starting Travis Etienne more than likely as your RB2. And now he gets a matchup against the LA Rams, who currently allow the third fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's even with Derrick Henry having a solid week against them last week. Alvin Kamara is going to stay a fringe start as of right now. Kendre Miller is also not a guy that I could put as a fringe start either. I know Kendre Miller is trending up for some of you, and I know Alvin Kamara is trending down, but we got to keep going in this direction with both of them. They got a matchup against Chicago this week, who currently allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now, a minimal amount of those points are coming from receptions and receiving yards. For the most part this season, they've done a good job of limiting running backs in that capacity. However, even with Chicago already being on a bye, they still allow the 7th most rushing yards. Alvin Kamara, 5 targets, at least in the last 3 games. Now that's good because that's the mark that I've been asking them to hit after the first couple of weeks of the season. You weren't seeing that type of work. For Kendre Miller, he only had 8 carries last week. Alvin Kamara had 10. So you're unable to start him as of right now. Even if you see his workload getting a little bit better each and every week, I don't think you're going to see him become fantasy viable unless Alvin Kamara were to be traded, which doesn't sound like it's going to be likely at this point, or he were to be injured. Overall, DeAndre Swift had a really solid performance against the Washington Commanders on Monday Night Football, but a lot of those fantasy points came in the second half, and some of those bigger runs that led him to getting over 100 yards also came towards the end of that game. It took a while for DeAndre Swift to get going. Now, once he did, he provided you some excellent fantasy points, so at least you have that. And this matchup this week is not super difficult, so DeAndre Swift has an opportunity to find something towards the top 12 ceiling once again. Although I do feel like his floor is still on the lower side because New Orleans gives up a lot of points through the air. And if New Orleans can keep it close, Chicago may be throwing the football quite a bit. And one thing to make note on too with that game on Monday Night Football, some of those fantasy points probably don't end up happening if the Washington Commanders hold on to the football and don't fumble it away. So it did take a little bit of luck for DeAndre Swift to end up having the week that he did. He had a huge touchdown reception, that's good. But a lot of those rushing yards that came at the end of the game, if Washington holds on to the football and kicks a field goal there, or maybe even picks up the first down, DeAndre Swift probably doesn't get those yards and is under 100 yards rushing. Devon Achane is coming off of a huge week, but unfortunately, he has got an extremely tough matchup coming up against the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland right now allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game, but they're allowing the 5th fewest receiving yards as well to running backs, and they haven't allowed a receiving touchdown all season long, which is where some of Devon Achane's upside ends up coming into play. However, in a matchup like this, you need that receiving work to hit your floor because the rushing ability is going to be greatly reduced against a very good defense like this. Now, Achane did have 3 straight finishes outside the top 12 that was snapped by his performance last week. And this week, I think we kind of get back to that top 24 performance instead, where we're hoping for some work in the passing game, hopefully a touchdown, whether it be a goal line touchdown or something through the air, and that can get us inside the top 24 safely. Quinshon Judkins had his first disappointing performance of the season last week, but now he gets to bounce back against Miami, currently allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game, the most rushing yards, even though they've only allowed 3 total touchdowns to running backs. That just goes to show you how much volume they're giving up to running backs right now, even if they're not scoring. Last week was Quinshon Judkins' first game this season where he had under 60 rushing yards. It's only the 2nd time this season that he's finished outside the top 24. I expect him to be back inside the top 24 with some really solid top 12 potential this week. This is a really solid matchup for the New England backfield, and I'm going to assume it will be Ramondre Stevenson still this week. Right now, the Tennessee Titans are allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game, the 3rd most rushing yards, and they've allowed 9 rushing touchdowns this season to opposing running backs. That's the most in the league. Now, the reason Ramondre Stevenson isn't just a flat start this week is because Travion Henderson continues to lurk. And I know he hasn't taken over the backfield as of yet. And I know Ramondre Stevenson has fought through some fumbles and even some inefficient play to continue to hold on to the starter role. Even last week, Stevenson saw 72% of the snaps. Travion Henderson, even with Antonio Gibson being done for the year, only saw 30% of the snaps. If Travion Henderson were to take over, I mean, it could happen at any point in time. And if that does happen, you're going to get caught in a tough spot with Ramondre Stevenson. But as of right now, I think we can still continue to utilize him, knowing that his ceiling is not super high, but in really good matchups, he could still give us a solid floor. I know I've given Tony Pollard props for his really solid RB2 floor all season long at this point, but this week, I can't do it. And I'm going to list him as a sit going up against New England, currently allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game, the 4th fewest rushing yards, and only 3 total touchdowns to running backs so far this season. Now, last week, Tajay Spears only saw 4 targets, but with the great possibility that Calvin Ridley ends up missing this week, you got to wonder if Tajay Spears is going to be more involved in the passing game. Now, on the ground, Tony Pollard has a tough time ahead of him this week. And now that Brian Callahan's been fired in Tennessee, you gotta wonder what will the offense end up looking like. There are some things that we will keep in mind this week. Tony Pollard is a guy that I really don't want to risk it with. Now, Tajay Spears, I would potentially be willing to risk it if it's a PPR league, and if it's a half PPR league, he's got to be one of your last options. But going up against New England with the great possibility of seeing some negative game script here and no Calvin Ridley, Tajay Spears could get involved in the passing game, and for those of you that are super desperate for some help, maybe he could help you this week. The Las Vegas Raiders, the Kansas City Chiefs, and for the Raiders, Ashton Jeanty, over the last 3 weeks, has been the RB4, and he has 4 touchdowns. For those of you that held on tight after a disastrous start to the season, you're starting to see that draft pick pay some dividends for you. And in this matchup, hopefully it continues. Kansas City, middle of the road. They did shut down the Lions last week, but I think the Lions kind of got away from some of the things that they were doing. And unfortunately, that just ended up being the rest of the game script for the Lions, which took Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery out of the equation on the ground. So for Ashton Jeanty this week, I'll go back to him being a start. The ceiling isn't as high as the RB4 numbers he's been putting up, but the floor should still be top 12 potential. For Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt, it's really difficult to start either of these guys right now. If you have to pick one, it's got to be Kareem Hunt. Isaiah Pacheco, he has 1 top 24 performance this season. For Kareem Hunt, he's been inside the top 12 once, and he's been inside the top 24 once. Kareem Hunt is touchdown dependent. Isaiah Pacheco just isn't seeing enough high leverage plays right now to be warranted as a start in any league. Fantasy football this season has been filled with a ton of up and down performances outside of maybe just a handful of players. And for Saquon Barkley, he's no different than that right now, and he looks like a human at the running back position so far in 2025. He's exhibited barely any upside, and now at this point, he's also banged up as well. So how healthy is Saquon Barkley? He hasn't run for more than 60 yards since week 2. That is some terrible, terrible ceiling, but the problem is, can you sit Saquon Barkley? Like, if you're in an 8-team league, maybe you can afford to sit Saquon Barkley because everybody has a ton of really solid options and you just need some upside. But if you play in 10, 12, 14, 16, whatever it may be, you can't sit Saquon Barkley. You got to be playing him. And that's what happens when really high picks just don't end up working out. You got to just run with it because you don't have anybody else that you can play. And you just got to hope that they find their upside at some point in time. I'm still holding out hope that in the second half of the season, Saquon Barkley gets some things going. And maybe the first half of the season is just managing his workload. Coming out of the bye from Minnesota, we have at least another week before we'll see Aaron Jones with the possibility of returning to action. So for this week, I'm going to go with Jordan Mason. I'm not going to list Xavier Scott at this point. I really don't think that there's a reason to. Could he see a little bit of work in the passing game like a few weeks ago? Absolutely. But 2 weeks ago against Cleveland, he didn't see any work in the passing game. So I don't necessarily think that he's just going to be bought in to this huge pass catching role. It could happen, but there's really no evidence to back that up right now. For Jordan Mason, he'll be the guy this week, more than likely, once again. Now, he was a little bit banged up before the bye. Haven't really heard that big of an update at this point. If something changes, obviously we'll pin a comment and let you all know. But for now, Jordan Mason will remain a start, going up against the Philadelphia Eagles, currently allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game and the 6th most rushing yards to opposing running backs. Last week, Cam Scatabo had 98 yards on 19 carries, but the big part of it is he scored 3 rushing touchdowns. If Minnesota can move the football, Jordan Mason's going to have an opportunity to score. Carolina at the New York Jets, and we'll go with Rico Dowdle as a start this week. He deserves it after monstrous performances in back-to-back weeks. But as of this recording, we still don't really know on when Chuba Hubbard could end up returning to action. And when he does, are we going to see a purely split backfield? Because I don't think Chuba Hubbard deserves to lose his job, but Rico Dowdle has obviously earned the chance for more touches. Dowdle has been the RB1 overall in each of the last 2 weeks. And this New York Jets defense, I mean, could he have another solid start this week? Absolutely. It's not a high-end matchup by any means, but he could still end up being extremely solid with no Chuba Hubbard once again. But once Hubbard returns, we're going to have a lot more to talk about. In what world does it make any sense for the New York Jets to give Breece Hall 0 targets in a week? Justin Fields looked terrible last week, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that Denver's defense is just really, really good. But when you're facing that much pressure and if you're having that much trouble moving the football, why are we not at least giving Breece Hall some design targets? That doesn't make any sense. So hopefully the New York Jets learned their lesson a little bit from last week. But with Garrett Wilson being injured and likely going to miss some time, Breece Hall could end up seeing a ton of targets moving forward. Overall, this matchup against Carolina is kind of middle of the road. I don't expect a super high ceiling from Breece Hall. However, his floor could be really solid because at least 5 targets this week seems absolutely likely. There's going to be a ton of people that are like, Cam Scatabo, a fringe start? Are you kidding me? I wouldn't take too much into what we saw last week against a defense that's been pretty poor at stopping running backs so far this season. Denver has been way better. They've only allowed 1 rushing touchdown all season long, currently allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Tyrone Tracy, I was shocked that he played last week. I really was. Even in my start and sit analysis, since it was Thursday night, a lot of people came back and was like, oh, terrible analysis. You missed this one. But I really didn't, because I didn't expect Tyrone Tracy to play. And I still expect once Tyrone Tracy works his way back, he'll start seeing a little bit more and a little bit more work. Now, Cam Scatabo right now, especially after last week, has done nothing to lose that work. But in this matchup this week, especially if Cam Scatabo has trouble running the football efficiently, I would not be shocked if we saw a little bit more of Tyrone Tracy now. The New York Giants have not allowed a receiving touchdown to a running back this season, and so far have kept the receiving game in check for opposing running backs. So RJ Harvey, we're not gonna get cute with him this week. He's gonna end up being a sit. However, the New York Giants are allowing the 7th most rushing yards, so J.K. Dobbins will be a start for us here. Much better matchup for him, definitely a solid floor with this type of matchup. I don't really need to spend a lot of time on Jonathan Taylor. He's had 4 top 5 finishes so far this season. He's the #1 overall running back on the season as well, and he is a guy that will continue to be in your lineup. That performance from Kamini Vidal last week is not something I anticipated either. This is a guy who was not even active the first 3 weeks of the season. And then once he was activated, he wasn't even seeing any playing time. He didn't get any playing time until Omarion Hampton went down with his injury. So I was shocked that Hassan Haskins didn't see more touches. But it also may have been a game script thing. It also may have been a game plan thing. And both of these running backs could still end up going back and forth. This matchup for the LA Chargers against Indianapolis, who's currently allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game, exhibits a much tougher matchup that Vidal may not be able to take advantage of. I have to list Vidal as a sit though this week. I can't list him as a start based solely on one performance against the Miami Dolphins, who have been a terrible defense against the run all season long. Now you're stepping into a much tougher matchup against Indianapolis, and I still think we're going to see a backfield that is much more split than what you saw last week, and one that could roll with the hot hand. If you're in a position where you have to start somebody and Vidal is an option, then I don't blame you if you try to ride the hot hand with him, but I certainly have to make it known that this is not going to be an easy matchup this week. Washington is going to get a great matchup again this week going up against the Dallas Cowboys. And Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt should have ended up having a bigger week last week. Unfortunately, that fumble at the end of the game took away some points for him, and it took away the opportunity to score more points as well. That fumble was not on Merritt, though, so I'm really hoping that Washington doesn't punish him by not playing him as much as this week. That ball was slipping out of Jaden Daniels' hands even before he got turned around to try and hand the ball off. Right now, the Dallas Cowboys are allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. JCM has a solid floor once again. There will be some big play potential baked in, and he will have touchdown potential as well. Javonte Williams is coming off his worst performance of the season last week, and unfortunately, it was only the second time all season that he scored less than 10 fantasy points. And this week, going up against the Washington Commanders, it's a middle-of-the-road matchup, but I could see him reaching that 10-point floor once again. The thing with Javonte Williams is Washington gave up quite a bit of yards last week to DeAndre Swift. A lot of those came at the end of the game, but regardless of when they came, we know that they were successful through the air and on the ground using DeAndre Swift. Hopefully Javonte Williams, regardless of when he gets the yards, can take advantage of the same matchup. For Green Bay and Arizona, Josh Jacobs is going to have a huge ceiling once again, going up against a defense currently allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. He has 2 touchdowns in each of his last 2 games and 6 touchdowns on the season. Touchdown potential will be there. Volume potential will be there. Ceiling potential absolutely be there. I'd have him in the top 5 at least. Arizona has a much tougher matchup though, Green Bay allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And with the late morning announcement that Bam Knight was going to be the starter over Michael Carter, and then Emari Demercado being injured and missing part of the game, I'm sitting both of these guys in this matchup. I don't know, is Bam Knight going to be the starter once again? Because he wasn't even the starter. He ended up seeing more touches as the game went on after Demercado went out, but Michael Carter was the guy to begin the game. So I don't really know where that report came from. And I even talked about it on the live show Sunday morning. These teams can be full of sometimes. For Atlanta and San Francisco, we've seen this song and dance before with Tyler Algier. Now, Bijan Robinson continues to be a mainstay in our lineup, over 200 total yards last week. And even though he's not seeing more touches than what we would like, he's doing a lot with those touches right now, which is great. Tyler Algier, we've seen it before though. He'll score a touchdown, he'll have a big week, and he looks like a guy that maybe you could start as a fringe option in your flex position. And then he comes back the following week and disappears. If you remember earlier in the season, him and Bijan had a huge game, and then they both disappeared the next game because Atlanta just didn't run the football. Going up against San Francisco, run the football, Atlanta. But for Tyler Algier, for me to actually start him, I'm going to need to see 2, 3, 4 games in a row where he's actively being used more often. Atlanta might be allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but that doesn't matter. We're clearly starting CMC. Historic work in the passing game. Tons of volume, even in a tougher matchup, still a decent floor just because of that. We've got 2 Monday Night Football matchups this week. The first one will be Tampa Bay at Detroit. That one will kick off at 7 o'clock. Bucky Irving's already been ruled out for this game. He was ruled out on Monday, actually. So very early in the week, we knew Bucky Irving wasn't going. Rachaad White will end up being the guy. Now, Detroit is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game overall to opposing running backs right now. And even though Rachaad White is probably going to have a tougher time on the ground, maybe finds a rushing touchdown, it's the potential work in the passing game that really still solidifies him as a start. Mike Evans is still banged up. Emeka Egbuka is now banged up. Chris Godwin also already been ruled out. And like we mentioned, Bucky Irving out as well. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery had a disastrous week 6, like a lot of studs did. And that was the first time Jahmyr Gibbs scored under 10 full PPR points, dating all the way back to the first few games of his rookie season. That's how good he has been, and how unfortunate his performance was against Kansas City. Now this matchup, way better. Tampa Bay is allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I expect Detroit to run the ball more effectively this week. And I expect both of these guys to have touchdown upside once again. The second Monday Night Football matchup will kick off at 10 o'clock with Houston at Seattle. Nick Chubb and Woody Marks, they're both going to be a sit for me in this matchup against Seattle. Why is that? Well, 3 weeks ago, Woody Marks was supposed to be the guy. And you saw it in an uptick in how he was being used, his snap percentage, and his overall performance. And then 2 weeks ago, Nick Chubb ended up being the guy and Woody Marks wasn't even to be heard of. So right now, I really don't know what the game plan is for this backfield. If it was a much better matchup, I would consider fringe starting 2 of these guys, maybe just one of them, really kind of depending on who they would be playing. But in this matchup against Seattle, on the road, I think Houston's going to be throwing the ball a little bit more often. So for me, both of these guys, I'm going to be out on, even though one of them probably scores a touchdown. Unfortunately, I finally reached my breaking point with the Seattle backfield. There's really no rhyme or reason to how these guys are being used, and the run game overall is terrible in Seattle right now. Could it get better? Absolutely. Am I giving up on both of these guys? I don't want to, but they have some really bad matchups coming up over the next several weeks towards the end of the season. And because of that, you're not going to find much more upside than what they've already had. So for now, I'm going to move them to being sits. If somebody ends up getting hurt, or if we end up seeing a better performance consistently from one guy or the other, maybe we'll take a better look at it. But it doesn't make a ton of sense. Kenneth Walker is still inside the top 24 of most touches for running backs this season. Zach Charbonnet, statistically, when you take a look at a lot of his underlying stats, is one of the worst efficiency running backs in all of football right now. So I don't know why we keep getting these different game plans on a week-to-week basis. Headliner Nation, hopefully all of this analysis today has got you thinking about your lineup and what you want to do this week and who gives you the most upside, who gives you the best floor, and what guys could be the worst for you to start. Make sure you hit that like button for me. Make sure you subscribe if you're new to the channel. Turn on those bell notifications so anytime we drop new content, you'll know about it right away. Headliner Nation, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.